but I've seen some Kickstarters, and I have to look further into it. They claim like it's actually only certain frequencies of blue light too. So that like there's new blue light filtering glasses that keep like better color retention without while still reducing all the eye strain.
I have found that the blue light filtering definitely makes me feel less worn out after a day on the computer.
It's just a game changer for sleep, I would say.
Yeah, I stopped using the blue light filter for a bit, and my sleep has been pretty crap lately, so I think that might actually be why.
Man, I can't even use, like, the only time I can use non-blue light filter on my computers is, like, not nighttime mode, is in, like, the middle of the day. Like by like 1 or 2 in the afternoon, my eyes start to bleed, and I turn it back onto nighttime mode.
It's hard for gaming though, because it just completely washes out or interferes with some of my games. It's really weird. I don't understand why, but I noticed that I get performance problems.
Yeah, it might be where the glasses are better, because I always use glasses when I played League.
That's what I used. Yeah, I just use the glasses if I want to actually game with light levels set normal.
I just fucking absorb the blue light and
makes you stronger.
Sleep. Yeah.
You just
whatever doesn't kill you make you stronger.
Exactly. I was gonna say. There you go. You guys becoming the Uber Munch.
You guys will be contributing to the downfall of Western civilization. Me, on the other hand, yeah. No thanks.
Well, speaking of Western civilization, we can talk about one of the greatest proponents of it or one of the greatest enemies of it, depending on which side of the political aisle you fall.
I would say no matter what side of the spectrum you're on, you'd say Obama is a great perpetuator of Western civilization because he's neo-colonialist.
Yeah. That's the main thing that people dislike about him, is how well he perpetuated Western civilization.
Yeah, that's true.
Like, regardless of which side
according
you're
to
on.
some of the right-wing blogs that I came across, he's a radical communist, so...
To be fair, communism is also Western civ, so
yeah, that's true.
Checkmate.
Yeah, I know. It's pretty colonial ideology, so I do find it funny that you see the crazy left-wingers that push it, liking it so much and then linking it back to like decolonizing things, and then they say, oh, well, communism is going to be the way we're going to run things. It's like,
it's not colonialism if you roll in with your tanks, take over the country, and install a communist government. Because then it's a communist government. It's not a puppet state.
Yeah, plus you starve half the
spreading
citizens
the true word, like the people's word.
Yeah, like East Germany, like they just loved being communist and would have never had it any other way.
you had to literally rip the wall down against their great protestations. You saw all the East Germans hand in hand, arm in arm, trying to defend the wall. Oh yeah, I remember that.
All right, so we're going to be chatting about Obama's legacy. It's been 4 years, and now we're into another Democratic Party, so thought it would be a good idea to take a look back and see what actually remains after the dust.
Normally you wait like a couple decades, but it's internet era, so now like 4 years is like multiple, like a century, so we're actually late on the punch. I'm pretty sure. I think everyone's done with Obama's legacy in like 2017.
Yeah, I know all the articles I was looking at.
Not 2016.
Yeah, they're like, by the time he was like on the way out, they're like, okay, this is what happened.
Okay, what's his legacy? I actually did find some articles that were written in 2016 that were talking about it already before he had even like.
I found the BBC interview with him asking him about his legacy while he's still a sitting president. Well, now you're in your lame duck period. So, what do you think about your legacy?
It's kind of like giving someone a Nobel Prize a couple months into office. A little premature, I might say.
Yeah.
All right. So, yeah, I think the impetus was just the fact that it seems like a lot of people from the right have been driven insane by him, and it's probably not a fair shake. But I also saw a little bit of that on the other side too, like on the left, see quite a bit of criticisms directed at him. So we thought it would be a good idea to just take a look at it and see what his actual legacy is and unearth what we could. Do you guys want to give your thoughts before going into this, Hubbards?
Sure. Yeah, it's really hard to like get a grasp on everything, like just thinking about it, because Obama's been in the zeitgeist for a long time. But one thing that I was thinking before going into this is Obama was he was like the proto-Trump in terms of when he got elected, because he had run himself as kind of like the further left option to Hillary Clinton in the 2008 primaries, and he kind of grabbed the base out from under her, which obviously worked out. He pandered to the base really hard and won the nomination on running kind of a far left or farther left campaign, and also I would say anti-establishment to a certain extent campaign. Not explicitly anti-establishment, but more kind of pro grassroots, more or less. So I did find that was one of the things I was thinking about going into this legacy conversation, was that he had a lot of parallels there with kind of setting up the ground for a grassroots campaign. In office, there was a couple things that I kind of seen about him. He was pretty hawkish in terms of, he plenty of drone strikes. He did intervene in Libya. He had not really held back internationally too much. Wasn't afraid to get his hands dirty. Went into, like, he authorized the obviously Bin Laden kill in Pakistani territory, which is pretty
ballsy.
Yeah, ballsy in terms of international, just going into another country and essentially killing someone. So the other thing that going into this was, like, he didn't have much for scandal. Like, it's pretty astounding, but after coming out of the Trump years, it's just like Obama. There's, you even go, I couldn't off the top of my head think of like one major like personal scandal that was really huge.
Suit was a disaster. Okay, that was an absolute. It was worse than anything else that had happened under any other presidency.
Like, yeah, he just didn't have any personal scandal really. Like, there's nothing you could really criticize him personally for. His personal, I guess I don't even know if it came out in his presidency, but his weed smoking or whatever, and when he was younger,
he used. Didn't he use crack? It came up during
cocaine.
I think it was just cocaine.
Run.
Yeah,
oh, okay, cocaine.
He got ahead of it. He wrote a book.
His drug use, yeah, as you were saying, he came out ahead of it, so it couldn't have been a scandal because.
And that was like when he was in his, like, what, late teens, early 20s was like his. Yeah, that was his big scandal. Was like 30 years ago. He did some drugs, I guess. And then aside from that, yeah, he was. He seemed like a progressive that knew how to play the game, I guess, or like tried to play the game to actually get something done. But yeah, that's kind of how I thought of it going into it.
How about you, Bryce?
Yeah, I'd say my main framework for picturing Obama is a pretty archetypal neoliberal, and that I would say on the usual left-right scale, I would call him a progressive conservative, like very near the middle. A lot of things in which he wanted to progress the values of American society, and then a lot of areas in which he conserved the existing status quo. And I think the biggest perspective I had on his legacy before researching it was that he had been effectively stymied for about 6 years by Republicans, and that he had kickstarted the economic recovery from the recession in his first 2 years. I guess in comparison to Trump, he was way more focused on multilateral global cooperation, and I don't think that was a really big, like, I would say that was a conservative aspect of him because Americans had been focused on that since the Second World War. So it wasn't a big departure at the time, but in retrospect, it's like, man, those were the days. And I thought he used a ton of executive orders, and I think a lot of people still are under the impression that he used a lot of executive orders. But in researching it, I found out that was incorrect, and he actually used less executive orders than Bush or Ronald Reagan and various other presidents earlier. That's probably about all I've got for other than what was already said.
Yeah, I'm pretty similar to both of you. The one thing that I noticed was I knew people that actually went down from Canada to the States to volunteer for his campaign. I remember it being a huge deal. His bid, because that was like when I was right coming into college. So it was, I think, among young people in that
the
time.
proletariat,
Yeah,
starting the workers' revolution.
exactly. These are young intellectuals. But yeah, there was quite a bit of passion and support, and like it seemed like a real change for the good, right? That was, at least with the segment of the population that I was in, it was seen as a massive sea change in the way things were done. And
the thing I remember from back then was I wasn't really plugged into like a group of people who thought politically, but just reading about it, I was very cynical. I did not think he was going to be much of a change from the status quo in America, because he'd never. And I mean, this is throwing back to what I read in like 2008. He never really made firm promises about things that were going to be radically different other than healthcare, which is a big progressive move. But I think a lot of people got caught up in the idea that he was going to change America, the entire fabric of America completely, in ways that he never promised to do at all. Like, he had quite clear goals, and he achieved quite a few of those, I believe.
Yeah, I would definitely say that as well. Like, there was, I think, a fervor around him that he was like, some of my research even showed that. We can get into it later, but yeah, that like in my actual experience, I had noticed that, because when he came to power, it was at a time like, when I was just starting to get into politics, and I do remember the climate around him and around the election and whatnot. The other thing that I thought coming into this was like the right seemed to just hate his guts. Like a chunk of the right
True.
Positively despised him. And I don't really understand, other than the only real explanation I could have is that he might have actually been a real threat to the establishment right and their grip over their general grip over politics in America. And I think that scared the shit out of them. So they had to spin it into this tale of this guy being an evil bastard who is looking to, cause problems for America. And he really, was a secret Kenyan and some garbage. And
never forget, he's coming for our guns.
Yeah, exactly. And so they whipped up their loyal but stupid base into a frenzy about him, even though it's, it was just, this is the only explanation that I've been able to figure out is, it's some people up at the top pulling strings to make people angry, because I don't like, and there's going to be partisanship up and down that's, organic, but I think a lot of it is driven by, at least what I can tell, driven by people up at the top who were scared that he might actually start to actually put in real policy change that would impact their bottom line. I think there was a lot of corporate greed influencing the vitriol against him. But overall, I thought he was a pretty good president, but was hamstrung particularly by the Republicans, but also the Democrats. But yeah, that was about all I had on top of what you guys already said. So you guys want to just launch into it, or do you have anything else?
Yeah, let's just launch into it. I was just going to discuss like the part of the context also is like what was just going on in the background with American politics. Like you were saying, he got hounded by Republicans at every level. I think you were onto something with him. I think that's probably one of the best signs that progressives are wrong about him. Like if he was such a status quo, do nothing, I would also put this term like neolib. Like that's what all the progressives will label people they don't like as neolibs or neocons.
Which is pretty much like you might as well be
I think if he was just like your, Hillary Clinton clone that was just gonna, steer the ship down the road at the, pretty much in almost the same fashion as a Bush would have, with slightly different flavor. I don't think he would have got that reception. I think you would have seen much more kind of normal politics around it. But I think the fact that he actually did have a streak of true progressivism with a actual intention to get meaningful change that would be a threat to the status quo and would change the status quo fundamentally, can be seen in how hard he was fought at every turn by members of his own party, and especially just the Republicans just had an outright game plan to fight him at every level. They had big meetings and strategy meetings that you can read about of them just saying we will not cooperate with him on anything. We will fight him tooth and nail to the death, essentially.
Yeah, I felt like that was driven pretty heavily by. It's like, what else is it going to be driven by? Because
Well, I think the cynical what else is driven by is that was while they didn't want the status quo to change, they also wanted to win elections, especially in the midterm, and that was pretty much their best play to win the elections, was to just decide before Obama even got into office that they were going to spend the first 2 years going against him at every single turn, and then that just worked out for them like crazy in 2010.
Yeah, because they won crushed the midterms.
I think that plays into it. But I also think there's something to just do with like the background polarization in America, right? Like people also forget the 8 years before under Bush. I would say Bush is a different animal, but Democrats were essentially, they had proto like the Bush derangement syndrome, right? Like they were, some Democrats, that was like the first kind of break from reality we started to see, was Democrats wanting Bush to, be hauled off to the Hague in the middle of his, presidential term and be prosecuted by the world courts for war crimes and have his whole administration locked up, right? Like, so. And
I know people seem to always forget that when, people are talking about Trump and his like locker up, and they're so upset about that. I think, remember how you've been screaming and protesting about how all of the entire ruling party during Bush's time should all be tried and executed for war crimes, like straight up. I'm listening to like podcasts from earlier things from last podcast on the left, and those guys, they're all talking about how Bush is a war criminal and he needs to, like, he should have been, thrown in jail and all this. It's like,
Well, I would say it was a fairly mainstream opinion in like, the New York Times type circles that Bush should be prosecuted and his entire administration should be jailed, essentially.
Yeah.
So, and then that, then people are surprised that Obama gets in and he doesn't receive any bipartisan support. Well, like that, I think at that kind of point in time in the American politics, bipartisan support was just not a thing anymore. Like it was, it had already so eroded. Yeah, it had already like there was hardly anyone willing to work across partisan lines at anymore, and the media landscape was already deranged to a certain extent, right? You had Fox News feeding out propaganda heavily already, MSNBC, and even the more respectable media outlets were fairly partisan in nature.
Yeah, like a lot of
So
people
that's
think
like the
this all
whole
started
background.
well, a lot of people seem to think that this started under like Trump. Like that was kind of one of the things I got in this research where it's like, oh, Obama was trying really hard and he was he's the gleaming light, and the Democrats were trying their very best to be good about this, and poor old bastard Republicans kept biting them every time they outstretched their hands to be receiving. It's like that is not true. Like I would think that like probably a bit more so that Obama was much more presidential in that sense, where he's actually looking to work with others. But it was kind of a lot of the flavor I got from reading it was the more left wing like CNN. That was their take. Like Obama tried really hard to rebuild and unify the nation, and but these bastard Republicans just weren't going to have it. And it's like,
Well, I mean, I think that's an accurate assessment, essentially. Well, not necessarily that Obama was trying to rebuild, but like Obama did seem to put some sort of good faith feelers out there with absolutely zero
uptake.
Zero uptake. So I think that is actually a fair take. Like the Republicans have to be held responsible for their just insanity and complete lack of.
But I do think that
I agree with that. But like the point that they were seeming to make was, and that is absolutely true. That, like I was saying before, it's like the Republicans vehemently hated him, which is ridiculous. But the kind of the point that I saw from some of these positions taken up by the left wing is like, this is like, the fault of the Republicans. It's like, well, this is the type of accusatory behavior that's causing problems. If you keep throwing these barbs at them, which like there is a very real criticism to be made of them, but it can't be done in the sense like from a moral, like they take the moral high ground in it and say, look at you guys are the problem. And I thought that
I think that's rich coming from the media, but from like a practical standpoint, I think that actually is kind of how the US has played out, is that politically the Republicans have been the ones that have ramped up partisanship. Socially, or in the kind of social sphere, it's been the opposite. Like the cultural ramping up of partisanship and polarization has been led outside of the political sphere by media on the left, usually, but not just media, but like that.
Just the general cultural milieu.
Yeah, that's been, I would say, the polarization there has been led on the left wing, and I think you see that by the if you look at like which sides have shifted in terms of, because sides are more polarized now. If you look at like the surveys of people's opinions, Republicans haven't really shifted that much in the last 20 or 30 years. General Republicans, in terms of what they think about things, it's been the left wing that has shifted their views to become more polarized from Republicans. Like Republicans kind of stayed where they were and what they felt about things, and the left shifted fairly substantially away from the center. Politically, though, I think the Republicans have been time and time again the instigators of the bipartisan, or the killing of bipartisanship and the dirty tactics. Like, and a lot of the time you have people say, oh, well, the Democrats just need to, fight fair, take the high road, and things will work out. And time again, they have been stabbed in the back, essentially, for trying those tactics. And a lot of people are now saying, well, if the Republicans are going to make no compromises, then the Democrats should just fight just as dirty and just as hard. And I think Obama was
also a disaster, though.
But I just think it's been mischaracterized. Like, it's certainly true that Obama made overtures to Republicans, but it's been mischaracterized, the sort of like altruism behind that, like as though he made these overtures at like he had no need to. He could have just rammed it through without any concessions and achieved a perfect progressive utopia. And it's just everything we're saying about the Republicans I mean, obviously, I'm going to think is relatively accurate, but a lot of Americans view that in inverse, as though the Democrats can be compared to that. So they're a monolith that can close ranks, when in reality they have a lot more divisions within their party than the Republicans do, at least when it comes to actually having to sell ideas to your own party members. So a lot of his overtures to Republicans were also overtures to purple Democrats in his own party, because he couldn't afford to lose Democratic votes on bills that he was attempting to pass.
Well, and I think, alluding to the midterms, he was also trying to keep his. He was doing that politically. You're right. Like, it wasn't altruism. He was trying to not get crushed in the midterms, which obviously he did. And that is an under, I guess, considered aspect of American politics, is that American politics has such frequent elections, especially the midterms for Congress is a battleground. Like, it is crazy how careful congressional candidates and incumbents have to be to keep their seats, because one wrong move, one wrong vote, that their constituents, and for purple Democrats, that can be very tricky, because if they make an overstep into progressive policy and vote party line, they can lose their seats instantly. So
that's what happened to Obama when in 2018. Like, it was one of the things I came across in this research is they lost. It was under Obama, they lost more seats than the Dems had lost, I think, in something like 100 years. It was brutal. Or no, maybe it was 50. But it was so many seats in so many different types of elections flipped red. I think Trump probably fixed a lot of that, but
that's also I mean, a lot of that is super hard to parse out on how much of that is Obama's quote unquote fault, and also just an intentional strategy by the Republicans, who have been, especially even down to the municipal and state level, really focusing on local elections to get power. So I think that's hard to parse out there. Like, what?
Yeah. The other thing to remember with the Republican strategy is that the midterms kind of plays back into the idea that the pragmatic move was to oppose Obama at every turn, because if they had had even one Republican break ranks and sign on the Obamacare bill or something, that kind of gives it a sense of, oh, maybe this isn't the awful thing Fox News is telling me it is. But as long as you all hold ranks and you all insist that it's terrible and awful and it's the end of America as you know it, then that's going to that's going to get you more votes than if you're kind of like, oh, that's a reasonable proposition. Yeah, I think I'll go with you on that one.
I think that's true. I definitely think that was a huge part of it, is being able to win the perception game of what was going on with the Obama presidency, right? Is the Republicans could close ranks and just say, yeah, this is all awful. This is all,
it's a
death panels and like this is bringing flashbacks of Sarah Palin, for God's sake. Oh my
God. Sarah Palin, I still maintain that was just the worst thing the Republicans ever could have done. Like, they had a shot and then they brought in Sarah Palin. It's like, why? Why do you have to do this?
I don't. Yeah, that really was a strange thing.
Saturday Night Live has her doppelganger on staff. You know they're gonna rip you apart.
Yeah,
so
and
dumb.
It just seemed like a misinformed play that, like, having a female representative was going to make them immune to criticism in that regard, and probably be like a positive, but it just really dragged them down, I think.
Well, I think it also just was weird that this is the best female candidate you have. Like, your pool might be a little bit shallow if this is the best you can pull out. Like, that was kind of what struck me, is like, how do you not have,
like, at least a couple, like, just somewhat functional people that aren't saying, I could pretty much see Russia from my house. It's like, no.
To be fair, I think a a lot of that probably behind the scenes was they didn't have very high hopes of their 2008 chances. So maybe it was hard to recruit someone to basically die on that field in that election, because it was seemed like a pretty strong chance that Obama was going to win. If I remember correctly, he was pretty high up on the polls.
The polls were quite favorable to Obama, and then it was closer than was expected. I think that's how I'm remembering it.
Well, because it was coming off the Bush presidencies, right? And people were just like, I think, sick of 8 years of Republican presidency at that point, especially
staring the recession in the face.
Yeah, and that was like so I think it was a pretty hard road to go down to be a candidate for the Republicans in that election. But yeah, Palin was definitely a weak choice. But
we should probably get back onto Obama.
I do think one like obviously everyone is going to remember Obamacare, and Republicans pretend that it was terrible, but looking at the numbers, it's just objectively massive success, it seems. I'm no healthcare expert, so the evaluations are a little bit tricky, but like some of the numbers I saw that were impressive was the uninsured rate substantially dropped from like 14-15% to 8 or 9%. So that's definitely a big win. I can't see how anyone would consider that a bad thing, to have more people with health insurance. And the other thing, like the Republicans always bring this up, like, well, premiums went way up during Obama. That's true. They did go up like 30-odd%. But what Republicans always fail to mention is that they went up 90-odd% under Bush. So,
the growth slowed down significantly.
Yeah, so premiums went up, but like way less than they were going up before Obama brought in Obamacare. So, you can maybe some of that was just premiums kind of hitting a natural peak. Maybe that can be argued. I'm sure that's a very difficult economic analysis to make, but at the very least, it does seem like Obama. It's not like Obama had higher premium growth than other presidents. He had much lower than Bush. So it seems like more people got insured, and they had better rates under Obamacare for the most part. Which I don't know how either of those things are a bad thing.
The left-wing criticism I've seen of Obamacare, and like I was on some sites for probably the first time in my internet browsing career of being on sites that are rated as extremely far left bias. So it's an interesting landscape. But they basically claimed that Obama should have put more money into the bailout, directed less of it at banks, basically throwing all the bankers in jail, and used his political capital entirely on that without like spending it on Obamacare to make sure there was a good recovery. And then because they had this thick recovery going on after spending trillions of dollars on the little man, then they would easily win the midterms, and then he could have done Obamacare. I was like, yeah, that's a fairy tale. But that was an interesting take by very progressive people.
I saw that even in some more moderately progressive circles, that he should have just focused on the economic side of things, which it's so hard to say in hindsight which would have been better. That being said, like, I think you'd run into the same problem if he would have waited until after the first midterms. Maybe he gets crushed in the 2012 election if he brings in Obamacare under in the 2011. Like, it's so hard to say what would have been. I think that's just such a
big like what if.
Yeah, exactly.
Right? Where it's just like,
I think you could
actually figure that out.
You could analyze. Like, I think you could make the argument that Obama went too soft on the direct payments. That's definitely like what we're seeing under for COVID, for example, has really highlighted how popular it can be just to hand out buckets of cash to people. Surprised. Yeah, that wasn't the that wasn't the economic consensus logic at the time. Like, I did look it up, and there were direct payments and direct tax cuts for people that were not insignificant. Like, they were, hundreds of dollars for many people, up to, for some of the tax cuts, it got into the thousands, depending on what you qualified for. So, but I think being able to just hand out a couple of big stimmy checks back in the 2008s would have been way ahead of the time, and probably would have got him some mass popularity. So I do think there is something to be said for putting less money into the banking system and more money directly into hands. But again, that would have been going against like conventional wisdom, I guess, at the economic level at that point in time. It wasn't really until COVID that people started to consider direct cash payments as viable.
And as I understand it, even what they did do was going against a lot of the conventional wisdom, which its success is kind of why the conventional wisdom has shifted to the point where direct payments in the future were a possible avenue.
Yeah, again, I think there is some to that, where the extent of the quantitative easing done in 2008, in the wake of the 2008 under Obama, was more than what would have been conventional wisdom for sure. Like, it was a move into new territory in terms of that, the level of economic action. And again, that is going to be part of, I think, a positive part of Obama's legacy, is that he did seem to kind of walk the line fairly well to set the U.S. up for recovery. And because based on some of the early indicators of how bad the collapse was in 2008, some people thought we were in for a decade of basically zero growth or actual GDP losses.
Decline.
Yeah, like, people were not sure if there would be a recovery for a decade. And within a few years, everything was, growing again back to, strong economy. Well, the start of a strong economy. So I think he will be vindicated in the end on his handling of the economic side of the things, for sure.
That's the one thing I found most interesting on the economic stuff, was that it definitely seems like 4 years is not enough time to have any sort of consensus play out, because you can find a lot of opinions from either that he handled it quite poorly to he handled it very well, and everything in between.
I think it's one of those things where it's really difficult to be able to figure it out in general, just given the complexity of the issue. Because from what I've seen in my research, some people were complaining about it and some were praising it. So it's one of those things where it is just so complex. It's hard to parse that out.
Well, it's also going to be heavily influenced by partisanship, right? You're going to have
Exactly.
There's not going to be of course you're going to be able to find voices that are hypercritical of Obama's handling of everything, right? Because he's a recent Democrat, so there's going to be conservatives that will, they will not give him, they'll probably criticize the Bin Laden. There was some that criticized his handling of Bin Laden, even though he got him, right. Like, he couldn't get a win. Yeah, one of the things was why wasn't like pictures in his body like put on display, essentially. That was one criticism I saw.
Instead of drawn and quartered.
Why was he just dumped in the ocean instead of like? But so he will every single thing that he's ever done in his presidency will be criticized at this point in time, just because there's partisan hacks willing to write that attack piece. But,
oh my god, the amount of crap I saw on that is just ludicrous.
Not being an economics expert, I will still put my money on the fact that his handling will be vindicated, just because a lot of the things that we saw in the wake of the 2009 was like, oh, this could be like a Great Depression 2.0, and there was like lots of indicators that this could be a sustained mess and a sustained recession.
Mm-hmm. And it didn't take that long to actually pull out of it. So
no, and it was a hard year and 2 years ish, but things got back on track relatively quickly, given how bad the crash was, and stayed on track. So I really do I do put my money. I would bet my money on him being vindicated on his handling of it.
Yeah, nothing will ever be perfect, but I do think it's quite likely that he at least did not handle it like badly as some claim he did. What else did you guys find in your research?
But one last point on Obamacare that I wanted to make, after all the talk of if he could have delayed it and maybe done it later, is that I didn't realize until researching this that 7 previous administrations, or maybe he was the 7th, so 6 previous administrations attempted to pass a universal health care, and he was the first one to actually manage to do it. So I feel like the amount of friction in that system against passing a universal health care
Doing anything
like can't be overstated. Like, that's pretty incredible that it took 7 tries to get universal health care in the United States.
Yeah.
Pretty interesting that a massive multi-billion-dollar industry can block things for so long.
Yeah, it's just like, it's not like, oh yeah, just delay that. Like, that has to, I feel like if you're going to get it done, that has to be like you're laser focused on that, like Obama was, and just getting it done. Like, that is such an achievement to do something that previous administrations had tried and failed at 6 times.
Yeah, if again, this is where I think that's a good segue into my next point would be like, I just think the progressives that criticize Obama are delusional, essentially, right? Like, they just think, oh, he had power of all three branches of government. He could, recreate Denmark in a day. Like, it just doesn't make sense. Like, that's an excellent illustration of it, that 6 previous administrations tried to do this thing and couldn't get it done throughout the administration's time. Like, and the U.S. is a notoriously checks and balanced, muddled system that is intentionally made to be difficult to revamp quickly. It's not, their political system is not set up for that in any measure. So I just cannot understand how the progressives think he'd be able to just, pop into power, bring in, huge increase in minimum wage, bring in, total different climate change policy. All these things just come in.
It operates as a dictatorship. It's like
quick trip to the presidency, 2 years in and out. We're a socialist country.
That essentially, like, that's the reason. Like, oh, you could just create a, what is it called, democratic socialism, or in a day. Like, you can just bring in all these executive orders, bring in all this legislation, and it's all going to come out. It's all going to get passed, and none of it's going to get reversed. Like, Jesus Christ! Like, you think that if Obama brought in all that stuff, it would have lasted the 2010 shift in power? No way. All of it would get defunded. Like, just on Obamacare, it barely limped by and survived, right? Like, through his him being in power, it barely survived because Republicans didn't allocate enough budget to it on purpose. They did all sorts of things when they got the House and Senate to undermine it, and it barely survived while he was in power. So to think that he could have just brought in all this stuff and it wouldn't get, repealed or shut down or sued and stuck in, legal purgatory and legal hell forever, it's just a fantasy.
Well, I think what it is, there's a couple things, because I have a corollary point to that. I think when you're dealing with people on, like, these, well, just in general, people don't understand at all how the world works. And I'm not saying that I'm not making a claim that I do, but one of the things is, when it comes to running a government like the United States, a lot of people, like we were just saying, they think you can just ram it through and it all works, and because you're the president and you're a dictator, essentially. They just don't understand how any of that works at all. And I saw the same problem with Obama's use of drones and dealing with terrorists. So there's quite a few criticisms lobbed at him from the left for his use of drone strikes and his handling of terrorists and whatnot. He was quite aggressive with it. And the thing that just struck me there is it just seemed like a complete fantasy land as well, because I think these people just have no idea. These terrorists are people who are aimed at the complete and entire, utter immolation of the West. And they are trying to gather the resources to build nuclear bombs to destroy it. So you have to deal with them. And unless you put boots on the ground, like if you don't want to put boots on the ground because that's not going to work, you have to do something. And it's not like you can just ignore them, or if you give them enough money that they'll all be fine, and democracy now takes over, and that part of the world becomes this happy, wonderful place. Now, obviously, could the Obama administration have made some missteps in in handling certain situations and killing civilians and whatnot? Yeah, but drone strikes, like they were in the beginning, were pretty rough, but they wound up getting really accurate at killing just the targets that they were looking for. I remember doing like some research into drone strikes, and in the early days they had some problems, but they became exceptionally lethal.
You have to be careful with drone strikes though, because the United States government, I think it was under Obama, but it could have been under Bush. I'm not 100% clear on this. They redefined like the definition of civilian to not include fighting age males ever. So if you bombed a group of 6 25-year-olds and one of them was a terrorist, like that had 0 civilian casualties, even though you just killed 5 people standing by.
Goddamn patriarchy. That's toxic masculinity.
Yeah, well, they were all terrorists just by being around.
But it is interesting that the left hates him for that, because that's definitely also a rebuke thrown at him by the right very frequently, that he's basically a what's the term? Doesn't practice what he preaches. He's a war hawk, like
hypocrite.
Yeah,
hypocrite. Yeah, because he's just out there and he's just bombing all these terrorists, and that's not what Democrats are supposed to do.
If you were just nice to them and you didn't interfere in their countries, they'd be perfect. It would be fine. There would be no problems. There'd never be any terrorists ever again. And I do think that there could be some. Obviously, that's all facetious, and that's not to say that the United States hasn't caused a whole bunch of problems, but it just struck me as like the peak of ignorance to think that Obama is some sort of absolute hypocritical douche for doing this. It's like, you don't I guarantee you the briefings he gets scares the shit out of him. When you take the White House and you're being told, yeah, this is this group, this is their capabilities, they've already executed these people, they are recruiting at this rate, you'd probably just turn white with fear and be like, oh my god, I have to do something.
If Obama's turning white, it's bad.
Yeah. He just bleached himself. Exactly. But you know what I mean, where it's you start getting those briefings and you're like, oh my god, I actually have to deal with this. Like, this is a huge problem. One of the articles I read was they would come to him, they'd give him they used to call them baseball cards of these various terrorists, and he'd pick which ones to fucking exterminate. And that's the decision he has to make. Otherwise they start, maybe that terrorist blows up a hospital full of people then like 2 weeks later, right? It has to be done. And I felt it so it just seems so childish for his critics to throw that at him. Like, oh, what a bad person for bombing terrorists. Well, I just don't think how any of this works.
Well, I think there is definitely like a huge level of reductionism in those types of criticisms, and I think that part of the problem is the U.S. definitely has a history of extremely mixed foreign policy in terms of being, and some of it is necessary and some of it's totally unnecessary. Some of it is clearly targeted at preemptive self-defense, and some of it's clearly targeted at securing, essentially resources, like literal economic imperialism for sure. Like that, there's no doubt about it that it's been a mixed bag. So I do see why people are sensitive to those types of things.
I do see that.
On the other hand, like, a lot of the people writing the criticisms probably, and none of us that are in the position like we are to sit around here and criticize have the inside scoop on what the national security landscape looks like, and that's just and the fact that there's been very very little terrorism in the U.S. from groups based in the Middle East or North Africa or whatever, I think is a testament to the effectiveness of it. Like, I don't know for sure. Like, I don't have the inside scoop, but my guess is that there's been tons of, post 9/11 plots on the same type of scale and time frame and probably even more ambitious, and none of them have been successful because the US and other NATO powers and that stuff are constantly working counterintelligence, constantly killing these high level terrorists and keeping their organizations on their basically on their back foot, and destroying their organizational structures. Like, and to be honest, like, I think in my personal ethics, that's a trade-off I'm willing to accept. Like, I find it hard to come to another conclusion or another strategy that's more like humane. Like, yes, there's collateral damage, which is horrible, but do you accept an increase in domestic terrorism in the United States or other Western countries as a trade-off? And what is the other thing is, like, what is the inevitable result of if you do allow these terrorist cells to kind of go unchecked because you're not willing to use drone strikes? Okay, well, there's probably going to be an increase in terrorist incidents, almost certainly. And what is the public backlash going to look like?
It's just
if
glass detonation now.
Especially if at that point in time you have a Trump in office who is willing to push the big red button, you might get a incredibly worse outcome allowing the escalation. It seems like a solid strategy to keep the terrorism in check. And the biggest problem with terrorism is it's trying to get the country to overreact. And so if you need to stop the terrorism to stop the overreaction and continue the cycle. Exactly. And a lot of those terrorist cells are basically death cults. They want the end of the world. Like, they're more than happy to usher in the nuclear war, essentially, right? So unless that's like kind of you're okay with that possibility of that angle kind of coming out in the wash, you should be much more thoughtful about what maybe the other consequences or the other choices on the table actually are.
And another thing to add to that is, let's say that you are able to secure your own border, and so you're not going to bomb these groups, but you're going to protect it well enough against your own, like, your internal affairs, that you aren't falling victim to terrorist attacks. But these things still run unchecked. They are not decent, upstanding people, obviously, and they're not going to build, because what they're going to do is they're going to terrorize their own countries wherever they are, and a lot of them are going to flood in from other places, and they're going to build little warlord fiefdoms, and they're going to be complete, like, it's going to be complete and utter misery for the people who have to live under them. Like, you just go listen to the accounts of women who live under these areas when ISIS took over. Like, they're just unbelievably horrible to everybody around them. They would just take the women as they wanted. They would kill people if they didn't, if they wouldn't listen to them or didn't fight for them or didn't give them money or protection. They're just brutal in every sense of the imagination. And so even if you can protect against them, there's also the question of, do you let, like, such groups take over large swaths of countries? And yes, you don't want to be, like, there's definitely something to be said about not being the police of the world, but at some point you do, like, I do think you have a nation like America has a responsibility to look at that and say, okay, well, we do need to deal with this in some way, because if these guys take over, even if we can protect against our own borders, they're just going to run roughshod over everybody else. Like, do you want 35 like 35 Gaddafis running the area, like probably not a great call. It's difficult. Like I don't think there's any answer that's going to be the perfect one, but I 100% agree that you have a responsibility to check your own overreaction to make sure that doesn't turn into a problem, and you also have a responsibility to make sure that just the general those countries in which they operate are not completely subjugated by those people.
Well, I do think that's a interesting point, because I think the U.S. got a lot of criticism for not intervening in the Second World War early enough, from certain quarters as well. Like, basically saying, why didn't the U.S. take a moral stand and,
well, they knew the Holocaust was happening.
Yeah, well, and they knew even aside from the Holocaust, they knew the danger and damage that the Nazi regime was doing in other realms too. And you had America First and other sort of organizations that were fascist sympathizers or fascists themselves, basically wanting America to stay out, and then the U.S. gets involved and wins the war essentially. And they're applauded for that. And now it's not, obviously they're not perfect parallels, but there is similar situations where like you said, there's these morally reprehensible by all measures groups that would love nothing more than to be able to set up like ISIS, a region-wide caliphate of misery, and the US intervention, not even putting boots on the ground, but doing targeted assassinations, is seen as like the imperialism of the worst kind.
It's like that was the thing that I felt it was such an unfair criticism pointed at him, that coming from a group of people who just they don't know what it really is like, and they're not thinking through the problem at all. I think we should probably I think I sidetracked the conversation off of Obama a bit too much, but yeah, I just felt it was just such a half-assed way of looking at it. Did you guys come across anything else about his legacy that you felt was well worth talking about? We've covered quite a bit.
One I was interested to read about, because I mean it was kind of on the back burner while he was in office, but I didn't know the full extent of it, and that was gun control. Because obviously the Republicans had their base whipped up that Obama's going to take their guns, and that was a huge talking point in his first term. And throughout his first term, that was never even on the table. Like, he went out of his way to tell Americans that he was not going to take their guns. So he didn't make any moves towards gun legislation while he had the ability to. And then in his second term, he had to deal with all of the meteoric rise of school shootings, and realized that there's problems with the American system that need to be addressed. But then he couldn't do it because of the Republican control of House and Senate. And what he did do was make executive actions, I believe is the term, rather than orders. So orders are legally binding. The actions are just a set of statements that he wants people to strive towards, but are non-binding, or not people, states. He wants states to work towards, but are non-binding, about basically common sense gun control. And according to some of his interviews around 2016, 2017, his greatest regret was actually not being able to pass real legislation on gun control.
That I didn't know that. I do have a funny statistic regarding gun control, I guess, is handgun production under Obama was up 207%.
Yeah, well, when Obama was coming in 2008, you couldn't buy ammunition in Canada because almost all of our ammunition is imported from the United States, and you couldn't buy ammunition in the United States because it was all bought by Americans who were scared that Obama was going to ban it.
Yeah, so the threat of Obama doing anything gun related, and in fact, it seems to have created record gun sales and massive increase in gun ownership. Um, Interestingly, though, well, I guess not particularly interesting, but just a continuation. Violent crime was down under Obama, so I mean, it's not like it was.
Yeah, it wasn't like they were using it.
Well, and the funny anecdote with Obama making everyone scared and buying guns is that Trump was the worst gun salesman ever because they had a dip in gun sales after Trump won because people weren't worried about it anymore.
Yeah, they definitely didn't need to be there.
Well, it's hard. It's hard to maintain those freaking highs under Obama. Like the gun,
Yeah.
it was ludicrous how many people were buying guns.
It's a bubble, you know, the gun bubble.
Yeah, it was interesting. Is there anything? Another thing to circle back to on Obama for foreign policy, and I think Price touched on it in your thoughts before. Really was his. I do think he had a good strategy in terms of bringing on board like-minded countries in kind of a very strong coalition. Like he was strengthen NATO. It seems he was trying to bring in the TPP to get the neighbor China's neighbors economically aligned with the United States to a larger extent, and I mean Canada was going to be part of that as well. So it would have been more than just the U.S. Integration. It would have been a several Western nations. I think Japan also in there, but also a lot of developing Southeast Asia countries as well. Just kind of building a bulwark against China and giving those countries an option other than China in terms of economic avenues for development and shipping and trade. So I think that's going to be something where I think right now it's not as clear. Like it's one of those things that needs time to percolate. But I think because Trump axed the TPP on exit, I don't know if I haven't followed if Biden's considering reviving that.
Well, the thing that happened is that the TPP was renamed to the CPTPP and signed in 2018 with the countries that weren't America.
Yeah, so has Biden made a peep about entering in on it? I don't follow.
No, I haven't seen any position that he would have on that. So that would be interesting because that would make a lot of sense.
I mean, he was in the Obama administration as the vice president, so maybe he has some thoughts on it. But I think that'll be one of the things where, in the long run, that's going to be something that is going to be damning to Trump's legacy and vindicating of Obama's legacy. The one thing aside from what Obama actually did, the one thing I will say is Obama didn't. I don't think he did a great job of speaking to the Republican base. Like the would-be Trump voters. And to be fair, I mean, it's hard to walk the line, but he definitely knew how to speak, obviously well. He's very well-spoken, and he was able to speak to people, in a non-elitist way. So he has the chops, but in comparison to someone like Andrew Yang, who really seems to have put effort into a lot of the groups that were neglected under, say, Obama.
Yeah. Well, he doesn't wear a suit and tie. He wears like a casual suit, and he has it sometimes unbuttoned, and he swears a lot. So it's like you're definitely not. It's not the same as Obama. Like
it's not even that.
I love listening to Obama, but I find Yang even more fun to listen to.
I think the problem with Obama was that he didn't want sound bites that could be construed kind of by the establishment as inflammatory or too spicy. Yeah, too spicy, right? Like he didn't want to have any spicy takes that because he was playing the establishment game, right? Like, and I'm not saying that that's a failing of his. I think he had to kind of play it to a certain extent to get anything done, but he wasn't willing to. And I think it's especially disappointing in his second term that he didn't maybe have some, more
a little bit more common man,
stronger rhetoric that was addressing a lot of the deep problems that people had. He kept it very I don't know, sanitized, I guess.
And with regards to that, I think it was incredibly clear because I read an article in 2016 on the economic state as Obama was leaving, and it was clear to everybody that most of the manufacturing jobs that were lost in 2008 weren't coming back. And so it was obviously clear to Obama, and that is exactly where I think like that sort of group, it formed the core basis for the Trump rally, was the people who lost their jobs in manufacturing and didn't see any sort of light at the end of the tunnel for them.
Yeah, you weren't getting like a lot, because I was looking into why the Republican base got so freaking mad at him, and it definitely seemed to be, there definitely seems to be a pretty strong resentment of it's the Trump base, right? And I think a lot of it is fueled by like a kind of a lack of care for that group. And I do think that I don't know, I didn't see a lot of evidence for Obama really trying to talk to that base.
But even I think even the progressive base on the left, which I mean a lot of people have noted that there seems to be a bipartisan kind of divide where there's the radical left and the radical right, and radical meaning anti-status quo, not necessarily extreme, just against the status quo. There's a lot of similarities there, and I think it's interesting that both the radical left and radical right, and the radical right has a lot of political power now under the Trump banner. But both of those groups, I think, are the most critical of someone like Obama and Obama. And I think a lot of it is to do with perception and optics. And Obama, I would say, didn't help himself because he was never willing to kind of, and I mean, it's a hard call. Like he kind of kept it sanitized, kept it very presidential, kept it very, moderate, and never really nothing too provocative that would rile up, or maybe stoke establishment status quo fears, anything like that. He kept it very, very, very light in that regard. And I think that, if you were on the radical left or right, you just don't see anything on offer from him in terms of the way he speaks and the way he presents himself, because he will not touch those kind of third rail topics that
from the establishment perspective, I guess.
Exactly, like things that would upset the establishment, and he won't touch them from either partisan perspective. Like he was hands off of those, and I do think that's going to that's a problem, because I guess it was he took the low risk path, and I can't fault him for that. He kind of just played it safe and tried to get what he could get done, and he did make progress, it seems. Obviously, I think he did a lot of good things, and his legacy will be, I think, solid for sure. But he played it safe, so he didn't get the coalesce, a bipartisan grassroots support for, say, the Democratic Party that could have really made a big change. And he didn't open up the conversation on more important topics and kind of push a more progressive conversation into the mainstream. He didn't really shake the status quo too much because he played it so safe.
Yeah, I definitely think that that's something I noticed as well with just what I remember from the media and then also just from my own research. One of the things that I wanted to also touch on a little bit is just like, and it relates to this, and it's the reason why I think part of that the Republican base who went over to Trump are just so enraged is, there really was like this holier than thou image around him where people were so enamored of him because he was quite literally, he was the first black president, and that's good enough of a reason for him to get a Nobel Prize. And I think quite a few people saw that, and then, with that and the way that a lot of he was canonized by the left within the first few months of him being president. And I think a lot of people on the right and just maybe even independents thought like, well, that's, what's going on here? Like, my life isn't getting better. I'm still out of a job. Like, I'm still suffering. And you're making this out to be like he's, and this isn't his fault either, not like blaming him for this, but it seemed like it seemed like very unjustified. A lot of like the praise and like accolades he was getting. And I think a lot of the right saw that and thought like, this is strange. I don't get it. Like, my manufacturing job is still gone. I don't have anything, like, I don't have a way of getting any, like a decent wage. And
well, if you're talking 2008, your job's gone and your house is foreclosed, and likely your second house is also foreclosed.
If you're talking to what, sorry?
If we're talking like 2008, like the first months of the Obama presidency, like it's not even your job's gone. It's your job's gone and your car's been repossessed and your house is foreclosed and your second house is foreclosed.
Yeah.
And your 401k is worth a third of what it was.
Like, that was just
2 years ago.
Nightmare world for a ton of people.
And yeah, and when you're canonizing the president after 2 months of him being in office, then I think that really marred his image in many people's minds, and it never really. And I think then it was really easy for the corporate cat assholes on the right to be able to paint him as this villain, and he never. And again, I don't think that is actually in large part Obama's fault. It's like all the. Well, I don't even know what you would call them, like suck-ups, just attempting to make themselves.
Well, I think that's like that is kind of a unique legacy of the U.S. Racial situation, right? Where it obviously was a huge deal that he was the first African American president.
It is a huge
for sure.
Deal. That's not.
That being said, is that a justification for, like you said, canonizing him essentially a few months into office? Absolutely not. And I think
Nobel Peace Prize and stuff like that. I think
that is a result of the first kind of tendrils of identity politics and that kind of nonsense weaseling its way into politics, right? Like, what is the Nobel? The Nobel is what country? Isn't that it's Scandinavian, right?
Isn't it Sweden?
Yeah,
I believe
think so.
Yeah, like so. Wow, shocker that Sweden would jump on the progressive identity politics bandwagon even back in 2009, right? Like, no shock there.
Norway is actually in charge of the Peace Prize, and Sweden's in charge of every other Nobel Prize.
There you go. So Norway, exactly. And again, it absolutely isn't Obama's fault. And
no, and
it's funny that the guy that awarded him the Peace Prize said he later regrets it and Obama didn't deserve it. But I think that was kind of indicative of the start of the identity politics, right? And the the left and right, but I mean the left did play that a lot, where they, oh, you don't like Obama, it must be because he's black, right? Like, oh,
Yeah,
you're just
that
racist,
was the
right?
other thing I ran into. So
And
that
also
was
not Obama's fault, but that did happen a lot for sure. And to be fair, I think some of that hit home a little bit on the Republican side, because it was true in not an insignificant number of cases, right? Like,
yeah.
I think there was probably, at least a non-zero, fairly probably still small, but a countable minority of people on the Republican side that absolutely that would have been a very big consideration
Yeah,
for
they
them.
absolutely. So one of the things that I looked up there is because that was what I was interested in. It's just like, why did the Republicans hate this president so much and tried everything they could, and why was there such massive support on the other side to get rid of him? Like this weird vitriol against him that I just felt was completely like unjustified and bizarre. So I tried looking into it, and it's hard to actually find, but like the closest thing that I could come, because like Ben Shapiro was on Larry King, and Larry King flat out asks him, like, is it because he's black? Like, are you and like the Tea Party pissed off because he's black? And Ben's like, no, of course not. Like that doesn't matter at all to me. And so I do think that that's he's saying the truth there, but I do agree that there's probably a big enough contingent of them that do actually have a problem with him being black, and that actually drives a lot of it. But I don't think it's like 60%.
There's plenty of Americans that were still alive from the pre-civil rights era that I'm sure were against the civil rights movement that are still alive in the U.S. You think they're jumping for joy that the president is black? Absolutely not. So again, I don't think it's a huge contingent, but it probably was a non-zero sizable minority that had problems with it, right? And again, there's probably people on the left that didn't like it as well, that he was black, but it probably skewed Republican for sure. That all being said, like, none of that's under Obama's control. The one thing under Obama's control was his, I guess, he ended his presidency kind of towards the end when identity politics was kind of starting to ramp up in 2015, 2016. And unfortunately, I do think that's going to be one of his negative legacies is he played it safe there too, right? He kind of, I don't have everything off the top of my head, but he did have a couple of Dear Colleagues letters that were fairly favorable to the identity politics agenda. And I think he missed an opportunity to shift the Democrats away from that, distance themselves, and he didn't at all. He kind of, I think he played into it a certain extent because he saw it would be politically favorable in terms of aligning himself with that contingent of the Democratic base. It's a good way to rally the base. Just like, Republicans continually embrace the evangelicals on their side and don't distance themselves to their, I would say, principled, for many of them to their detriment of their principles, right? I think the same can be said on Obama in the sense that he had an opportunity to put some distance and didn't, because he was, I would think, aware of how maybe that it would be a very useful tool to rally the base.
Yeah, I do think that he played identity politics a bit too much, and that even came out a bit, even in like a post, like actually pretty recently when he was talking about, he was on the podcast with, Bruce Springsteen, and he said, "Oh yeah, I absolutely wanted to get reparations done, but there's just going to be too much white resentment." And of course, there's a huge freak out over that. It's like, because it was kind of like a flippant, like, yeah, white people not wanting to help out black people, and people are rightly upset about that. And I do think, and this is borne out in the data too. Race relations, people's in the States, their perceptions of race relations was that it got like significantly worse under him, and that's obviously you can't put all of that on him by any stretch of the imagination. But I do think that as the president, you could try. There could have been some more attempts made to deal with it, and I don't think, especially near the end, he did a great job of handling that.
Yeah, and I will cut him some slack because, like you said, I think it is hard to analyze how much of it he could have prevented or could have intervened. And
he could have made things worse if he tried to do, like something else, right?
Well, the other thing I was going to say, it's just like that all goes back to, say, the polarization situation, where I think a lot of that is just background technological change and, so the rise of social media, the breakdown of mainstream media, all those things are having a huge impact in the background that the president has no control over.
Mm-hmm.
Like, what is Obama supposed to do about that? So how much of that can really be put on him is questionable. I don't think. Yeah, I think he could have made it better, but who knows?
Again, even just some sort of like prescient warning about identity politics, which maybe there's one defined in one of his speeches in the future, and
he has had a few lately, but not well. Like, I didn't find any. He had, I think, one or two while he was president. I think when he was giving some addressments to call it like a college, but that might even actually come after he was out. But
like it seems like from my understanding that it would have been like the race relations getting worse would be like the rise of identity politics, and that was on its way to happening no matter who was the sitting president.
Yeah, that'd be the point I'd make as well. Like he was kind of just in the driver's seat at a time when that was coming down the pipeline no matter what anyone did, right? Like there's nothing, I don't think, that has been, a lot of that stuff has been bubbling for 50 odd years, right? So it's not like he's just going to be able to make a couple speeches and all of a sudden people believe in Martin Luther King again.
Yeah, exactly. Like he could have probably set himself up in a legacy sense better, but definitely I don't think anything while he was in could have had much of an effect.
One last thing I'll say about Obama and his legacy. I think one of the most interesting recent things that I don't feel like gets talked nearly enough about even now is his refusal to endorse Biden until like the last goddamn minute.
Yeah,
it was looking like he might not even do it.
He had to literally be essentially dragged and put a gunpoint to endorse Biden, and I think if and when Biden's administration goes bad, which I think there's a decent chance it will, just because I don't know. I don't think maybe it won't go horribly, but I think there will be things that Biden does and as president that are going to be questionable.
Well, you've already started the rollout of them. Like you see the his mandate that any university that has public funding must allow anybody to compete in any gender of their choosings role for sports. So that
dude, I'm going to the US and I'm getting a free ride, boy.
Oh man, I should go down to apply to Harvard and try to get a Harvard education. I could go smash some mid-level female collegiate sports, no problem. And I'm not that athletic. It's just like
how does Harvard have a hockey team? I'm sure I could wear the C for the women's team. But I think it'll be more of Biden's like actual cognitive capacity that will start to fail even more markedly at some point in his term, and I think Obama will be vindicated in his late. Some people will probably criticize him for essentially caving and endorsing him at all, but I think most people will be like, "See, Obama was onto something."
Where
Like this guy,
his brain just starts melting.
That one's probably where, in the long term, people view it as like the lesser of two evils, because Obama basically had the choice between not endorsing Biden, and I feel like that would have actually done significant damage to Biden.
Yeah, I think that he could have lost because of that.
Because it was a close election. So it's like, do you not endorse Biden and let Trump win, or do you endorse Biden and just like hope and pray that it's just going to end up better than you think it's going to go?
well, never underestimate the extent to which progressives will completely ignore pragmatism.
True.
It doesn't matter that it might have saved a second term of Trump, but they will still criticize Obama for endorsing their.
Well, it would have been better to get Trump out of the way before he ran and won in 2024. So that was really Obama's problem. Like, get it 8 straight years. We don't need 12 years bookended by Trump. Like,
well, to be fair, I guess you could make the legitimate criticism that Obama could have thrown his hat in for a better candidate.
Yeah, I definitely think that should have happened, and I think his endorsement of like somebody like Sanders would have pushed Sanders over the top pretty easily. And
well, I don't think Obama would be
endorsing Sanders ever. Like,
yeah, I don't think Obama would be caught dead.
They are like the two antithetical Democrats.
To a certain extent, I think. But I don't think Obama would endorse Sanders.
No, I don't think so. But
Obama would have been more of a Klobuchar, Buttigieg type endorsement. But I think that may have been a better outcome than Biden. And I just think so it is such an interesting thing that the man that got 8 years of a front row seat to Biden's VP-ship would not, he chose him as his VP. He watched him for 8 years as his VP, and he said, probably not going to want this guy president.
Yeah, I don't think it's a good idea.
I do think that's going to play a role in his legacy, because he will definitely get, I think some of Obama will inevitably get some of the blame, for better or for worse, of the Biden administration, right? Because those two are going to be linked in history forever, right? Due to their Obama's presidency, right? So I think his refusal to endorse will be a positive, though, in the end. Yeah. That's my spicy prediction. Maybe not so spicy.
All right, do you guys have anything else? I think that was it for me.
Yeah, I think that about covers her.
Alrighty. Thanks, guys, for listening. Catch you on the next one. Peace.
Peace.